Hello and welcome to my reading update for Ghosts of Christmas Past, Resurrecting a Tradition, created by Vin at Revenant Reads. I also recommend checking out all my co-host channels. They're listed in the description box below. So we have Dave and Olive at Book Blather, Mindy's Book Journey, Mark from Books with Elvis, and Debs from Rainer Reads. I'll also be talking about my reading updates for the Cthulhu event that was created by Another Bibliophile Reads, Greg, and Big Hard Classics, Alan. Again, contact information down below. Be sure to give all of their channels a check out. And I'll be mentioning an exciting new event starting in January 2025, where my good friend and I, Ven, got to talking about rereading a big series, but more about that later. The ghost stories that I've been reading, we started with a group read of The Old Nurse's Story. This is by Elizabeth Gaskell. I have the story itself, but you can also find this story in a collection. If you haven't read the story yet and you'd like to hear it, I suggest going over to Book Time with Elvis, where Mark did a 5-part series. Most of us, I believe, in the Voxer group now have finished reading the story and people are sharing comments about it. I have yet to do the second read. I was hoping to do that in the last few weeks. Things have gotten a bit busy. Lily, one of the ferals, decided she may be moving in, so life's a bit chaotic at the moment. But I do remember from the first read, when I began the story, personally, I found it a little difficult in the descriptions following all the different family members. Our story is, as the title says, an old nurse talking to children about their mother and the home that they had ended up moving to, different events that were going on, and what had happened with the family prior to them being there. It's a very interesting tale, certainly not your warm, fuzzy type of ghost story, but certainly a ghost story with a message. Also, I've started reading Haunted Heritage. This is by Michael Norman and Beth Scott. Beth has since passed away, but when they got the contract to write these stories, it included both of them, and her name is still included, which I think is pretty amazing, and income goes to her estate. It's been an interesting read so far. I've just read a few of the stories. I do find it interesting that this is supposed to be based on North America, and yet only 3 out of all the stories are from Canada. But I am enjoying the read so far, and I enjoy it because it isn't just ghosts. It also includes history and different information about the land and events that occurred there. And for me, that is part of the interest in reading different ghost stories. I've also been rereading politically correct holiday stories. I love these. James Finn Garner has a very interesting sense of humor that I appreciate. On Thursday, I'll have the reading of A Christmas Carol. It's fairly long, so that will be in place of my live stream on the 19th. And on Friday, because it just worked out perfectly this year, I'll be reading "'Twas the Night Before Solstice." His stories, even he admits, although published in 1995, may not continue to be politically correct over time, and there are 3 books in the series. They're a hoot. They're good for a giggle, and I definitely needed that this month. After I'd read The Old Nurse's Story, I started my ghost reads with Where the Ghosts Are, The Ultimate Guide to Haunted Houses. This is by Hans Holzer in one of my recent book haul collections. So yes, I am getting through the books that I purchased. This was published in 1995. It's been somewhat of an interesting read. I enjoyed the first part because he gets into talking about what is a ghost and gives you some background information. I have marked here a quote. His book starts with a word of caution. Now hear this. This is the original ghost hunter speaking. If you don't know who Hans Holzer was, he was a parapsychologist and author. This warning that he has is from April 22nd, 1994, but he had been in the field for quite some time. If you know who Ed and Lorraine Warren are, chances are you've also heard of Hans Holzer. In the word of caution, he goes on to say, if you're seriously fascinated by hauntings and that very human and often tragic being called ghost, remember you're dealing with fellow people, not monsters, devils, or demons, just folks like you and I, who got into emotional turmoil on passing from this level of existence to the next, and therefore could not quite make it across. So his interpretation of what ghosts are, they're the spirits of humans who are now deceased and for different reasons have remained on this plane rather than moving elsewhere. So I've enjoyed his reads so far. Not sure I fully buy into some of the things that he's saying, even though he is a parapsychologist. It's still interesting to get that different take on things. Another book from a recent book haul that I've started is Haunted 2, Incredible True Stories of Ghostly Encounters. This is by Dora L. Williams. She is a Canadian author. In this case, they're awfully short, and that's the one thing that I do find sometimes with the stories is they're an interesting read, but you rarely get a conclusion. It's, I lived there for a few months or I lived there for a year. So it isn't the deep dive that I typically enjoy reading about. What I did appreciate about her book is at the back she has paranormal professionals, and it's as you can see, it's a fairly extensive part of the book. So she talks about different investigators, their experiences, and I very much am looking forward to checking that out. An interesting read, but like I say, they're short, and some of it I'm willing to bet had people stayed there would have been other explanations found for what was going on, but they came and went fairly quick. Those have been my reads so far. As I say, if you're interested in the history portion as well as a great ghost story, then I recommend Haunted Heartland. Another book that I had started reading a bit before is Haunted Christmas Ghost Stories. This is by Joanne Christensen. Some of the stories have been good. There was one I will never read. It animal trigger warnings, why you would have included that in a Christmas collection with a crappy neighborhood and an apartment that's broken in. Yeah, it ruined my entire day. And I stopped reading when I got to that. I'd been feeling better. The stories before. And again, I get, that whole meaning and the spirit of a dog, but that just did not work for me. And well, now I'm wondering what I'm going to read next. I may or may not finish her book. What I will also be reading from this month is classic Victorian and Edwardian ghost stories. I've already read all of these, so I know when I read them, it's not going to throw me for a loop. It was also awesome that one of the participants in our Voxer group also mentioned reading The Phantom Coach, which is one of the stories that I have in here that I also enjoyed. The author did a great job. It was Amelia B. Edwards of really pulling you in and giving you a sense of the cold and needing to find shelter, and then kind of throws you for a loop at the end of where that story was going. So there are a number of great stories in here, and I will be checking those out. That is all of my ghost reads so far. I'm also participating in the Cthulhu reading event. That involves reading Lovecraft during the month of December. My original plan was to read the Lovecraft Compendium again. I know all the stories are enjoyable. Yes, I have notes inside and Noah has seen them. But I decided to check my public library and I took out 2 of Lovecraft's books. The first is At the Mountains of Madness. This is a collection of 4 of his stories. And I was surprised to learn at the back of the book, it talks about the author. While Lovecraft was alive, his works appeared in popular pulp magazines, but he never pulled everything together as a book, and he actually died in relative poverty and obscurity. Like so many others, authors, artists, his work became famous and popular after he was deceased. At the Mountains of Madness takes up the majority of the book. It's about a group who goes to the Antarctic. He mentions throughout the Necronomicon, which I haven't read. It's something I'm going to have to check out and look into a bit more. And according to my notes, it begins with the narrator, who's a geologist. He's talking about his expedition to the Antarctic and why others shouldn't go to the same place. So basically, this story, the premise is he's warning others. There's another group that's thinking of going to look further into what they discovered, and our narrator is saying that would be a very bad idea. They talk about going by ship down there, all the supplies they'd taken. I found it immensely unbelievable that what they had taken were the supplies to put together 4 planes, and they constructed them down in the Antarctic. And again, remembering these are not current stories. You might be able to do it now, but back then it would have been a very different process. So part of that already had me humming and hawing about where this was going to go. And it goes on to talk about different things they've discovered, different events that have happened to other parts of their expedition, and it doesn't go well for the vast majority of them. Only a handful escape, which is why this person is so concerned about others going to that area. The other thing I found very unbelievable was he's talking about as they're going in these tunnels and finding different things, they're making all these sketches and relaying the information about this culture. And in my mind, there's no way you had that kind of time to do such detailed, intense sketches, plus figure out what all of this meant. So for me, unlike the compendium stories that keep you going, and it's not that they're necessarily believable creatures, but the events tie in more the way things would flow in a day-to-day world. For the Antarctic expedition, there were just too many beyond the believable parts that just, for me as a reader, didn't quite work. The next story, The Shunned House, definitely was a horror story in every aspect. We've got the creepy house. We have the young man who starts telling us about the story from when he was a boy and everyone staying away from this place. It's interesting because the description, the house literally borders onto the sidewalk, so people are passing it all the time. I thought it was particularly interesting that he mentions Edgar Allan Poe and talks about how Poe had walked past this house numerous times and for all his writings had never actually mentioned this house at all. As this young boy gets older and he's talking with his uncle. His uncle is also fascinated with this house but didn't want to share certain things with him when he was younger. The two of them get together, come up with a plan on how to go in, do an investigation. They get permission from the last living family member to this property, and it's a very interesting twists and turns type of story. Next is Dreams in the Witch House. This one actually reminded me of The Judge's House by Bram Stoker. We have two young men very intent on their studies. In the judge's house, the young man goes to be secluded to do his studies. In this case, the young man rents a room in a place called the Witch's House, and he gets the top apartment to rent or flat. And things go awry from there. He starts hearing sounds, he starts having unusual dreams, but he does have other tenants to talk to, and things just spiral very quickly. We get into different dimensions. It's interesting how he describes the shape of the room, and that will come up in one of the stories in the other book that I read. Again, it was an interesting read, and you weren't quite sure how it was all going to play out. The last story is The Statement of Randolph Carter. His friend has disappeared and he's making literally a statement on the events of what happened. For me, it's a moral about don't dabble in what you don't understand. Both of these young men were very interested in the unexplained. They decide to go to an ancient cemetery. They end up moving a slab, and the one ends up going down. He's got an idea of what or who he's going to meet. He tells his friend to stay up above because he doesn't think he can handle what they're going to run into. And needless to say, things do not go well, and like a number of other stories, this doesn't have a conclusive ending because the slab doesn't get replaced. I haven't read enough Lovecraft to know whether this story is ever picked up in any of his other works. Let me know in the comments down below if you know if Randolph Carter ever came up in another of the stories, or if this entity, creature, being ever came up anywhere else. I'll have to double check when I read the Lovecraft Compendium, but I don't think that's one of the creatures that came from the cemetery. The other book that is also a collection of his short stories, The Watchers Out of Time. I've only read a few of these, and I think I'm going to end my Lovecraft reading from this book there, as I do want to get back to the compendium. There's only 3 of the short stories that I read. The first is The Survivor, and again, it was definitely creepy. There were things happening, and again, you've got the sounds, the unexplained things. We have someone who rents a house that, of course, nobody else had wanted, and we find out that the previous owner is deceased. The neighbors want the house taken down. They think it's an eyesore. The property hasn't been kept up, but the owner was wealthy. There is a stipulation, and he left enough money to ensure that the property stays there and that his heir will come and claim the property. And there was enough money to keep the property intact, or there was enough money to cover 20 years. So we're already wondering, this individual wasn't married, and other people are wondering, how is this possible? We know the previous owner was doing different types of experiments with lizards, and there are different clues throughout of where this is going to go, but it's still a bit of a surprise at the end. Wentworth's Day was interesting because we have a salesman that is going past Dunwich, and the only Lovecraft I had read as a teenager was the Dunwich Horror, so the name of that town stood out for me. The salesman knows he doesn't want to go in this particular area. He's planning on just sticking with the highway and going through quickly because it's getting to be late, and he doesn't want to be caught in some of these side roads. Unfortunately, due to a heavy rainfall and construction, he ends up having to take a detour. He finds an older farm and parks his car in the barn, goes to the house. At first, there's no response. He's not even sure if anyone's there because much of this area has been vacated and most of the homes are abandoned. It turns out there is someone in the home, and things go awry from there. Peabody's Heritage is about an old home. The narrator is telling us that although his parents inherited the house, they never actually went to visit it, but for some reason they wouldn't sell it either. They lived in Boston, this home is elsewhere. So when his parents unexpectedly die in a car accident, this young man inherits the home. And as we find out with him moving there, obviously his parents didn't talk about his family history or the town itself. He's certainly not welcomed when he arrives. Like the people in The Survivor, the neighbors would really prefer this property just be left alone. But the young man moves in. There's an ancient crypt. He needs a key to get in there. He does something with a skeleton that probably should have been left alone. And like other stories by Lovecraft, we have dreams, we have sounds, and it all goes from there. So, as far as the three stories in The Watchers of Time, I enjoyed all three of them. They certainly fall into what would be the horror aspect. And unlike At the Mountains of Madness, we're not overreaching into the unbelievable in terms of certain things couldn't have happened. So I found that a much more enjoyable read. And someday I will borrow it from the library again and finish it. But as you can see around in my room, I've still got piles and stacks of things that I really need to start getting organized on. So I will be returning those books to the library. I have 5 different Lovecraft stories to read here, so I may just pick one up at different parts in the next few weeks. Part of the reason that I am really trying to get my reading figured out and narrowed down, and yes, these are 3 chunkers. They are the first 3 books of the Wheel of Time series, written by Robert Jordan. The last few books are by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson, I believe, because unfortunately Mr. Jordan passed away prior to completing the series. Ven from Ven's Corner had been talking about wanting to reread the series. He'd mentioned it a few times, so I mentioned to him, hey, how about we do this as a buddy read, as I've considered going through the series again. Originally, I read all of it but the prequel in 2022. So yes, I raced through them because I needed to know how it ended. There are 15 books to the series. Ven said, sure, let's do this. And then he had talked to some other people, and our buddy read has now become a group event, which is awesome. There is a group on Discord, and you can go to Ven's channel and find the link for that. I've set up a room in Google Chat, and that will be a learning process because I haven't really used it much, and you can share comments, you invite people into a room. The plan is to read 1 book a month. Ven and I are going to have a chat and figure this all out because I know we both have other reading plans as well. There's other events, life gets busy. So we'll see where this goes, whether we're going to do a live stream to maybe review each book and have a few other participants on to share their thoughts and ideas, whether we just keep it as a Voxer group, Google Chat, and Discord group. So stay tuned, and I will keep you updated with more information. That wraps up what I've been reading so far for the Ghosts of Christmas Past, as well as the Cthulhu event. Let me know in the comments down below if you're participating in either of those events. Also, be sure to check out all the channels that I've mentioned.